I faced my husband and his mistress. He smiled like he won. Then my lawyer said, "One more witness, Your Honor." Hi, welcome to my channel. Enjoy my new story.
At the courthouse, I had to face my husband and his mistress. His attorney spoke with confidence, fabricated numbers, carefully arranged testimonies, a story constructed with precision. Then he smiled at his lawyer like a man certain he had already won. But then my attorney said, "Your Honor, we would like to call an additional witness." The entire courtroom fell silent. The moment that witness stepped in, I saw the smile on his face disappear completely. I truly appreciate you being here with me. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments and be part of this journey. Please note, this story includes fictional elements for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental and unintended. The moment Eleanor Calloway placed her hand on that Bible, the entire room changed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies where someone gasps and the music swells. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it worse. My husband's attorney stopped writing mid-sentence, his pen hovering over the legal pad like he'd suddenly forgotten what words were for. And my husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years, the man who had walked into that courtroom like he was arriving at a business lunch he'd already won, reached out and gripped the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles went white. I watched all of this from 12 feet away. I watched him register, who had just walked through those doors, watched the color drain from his face in slow motion, watched that easy, polished confidence of his crack right down the middle like old paint on a wall nobody bothered to maintain. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent. My husband didn't respond. He just stared. For the first time in 5 years, he had nothing prepared for what was happening in front of him. The woman who had just taken the witness stand was 63 years old. She carried her handbag with both hands, walked in a straight line without looking left or right, and sat down in the witness chair the way someone sits when they have made an irreversible decision and are at peace with it. Her coat was navy. Her posture was the kind that comes not from ease, but from decades of deciding not to let things show. She did not look at her son, not once. My name is Brooke Calloway. I'm 34 years old and I work as a senior accountant at a logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I earn $58,000 a year reading numbers that other people hope nobody looks at too carefully. I have been good at that job for 6 years. I have been less good, it turns out, at reading the numbers in my own life. Charlotte is a city that presents itself confidently glass towers, downtown old neighborhoods, with wide porches, the kind of place where people build careers and call it living. I had done exactly that. I had built something careful and considered, and for 5 years I had believed it was solid. That belief, I would eventually learn, had been the most expensive thing I owned. To understand why that morning in November of 2024 mattered, why watching an older woman place her hand on a Bible could make a man, like my husband, go completely still, you need to know where the story actually starts. And it doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts the way most things start, quietly and in a kitchen on an ordinary afternoon when nothing felt wrong yet. Ryan and I had been married for 5 years when all of this unraveled. We lived in Myers Park, one of those Charlotte neighborhoods with old oak trees that arch over the road, and houses that look like they belong on the cover of a magazine nobody can actually afford to buy. He owned 3 upscale hair salons across the city. I handled the household, the bills, the groceries, the insurance renewals, the small, invisible machinery of daily life that keeps everything running. He handled the business finances. That was the arrangement. It had seemed for a long time like a reasonable one. He was the kind of man who made everything look effortless, charming in that particular way where you don't notice it happening until you're already charmed. He had an easy laugh and the kind of confidence that fills a room without being loud about it. He remembered the names of waitstaff and asked follow-up questions in conversations and made whoever he was speaking to feel briefly like the most interesting person in the room. When we met, I thought that confidence was one of the things I loved most about him. I understand now that confidence and certainty are not the same thing. One of them is a quality, the other is a performance. I spent 5 years mistaking one for the other. There were small things early on that I filed away without examining. His phone, for instance, was always face down on the counter whenever he set it down. Always. I mentioned it once. Early in our marriage, in the light way, you mention something when you're not quite ready to admit it. Bothers you. He smiled and said it was just a habit. Something about protecting the screen. I let it go the way you let things go when you love someone, and the alternative, not letting it go, feels like too big a door to open. His mother was another thing I had learned over 5 years to quietly accept. Eleanor Calloway had never warmed me, not in any meaningful way. She was polite, always polite in the manner of someone who has decided that politeness is the most efficient form of distance. She would hand me a cup of coffee at family gatherings without making eye contact, answer my questions with exactly as many words as were necessary, and then turn her attention elsewhere. At our wedding, she had hugged me once briefly, efficiently, and then moved on to greet someone else. I used to think she simply didn't like me, that I had failed some unspoken test in the early days and never recovered from it. Sitting in that courtroom, watching her settle into the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed straight ahead, I thought about how wrong I had been. Not about the fact that she'd never warmed to me. That part was true. I was wrong about why. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first sign that something was wrong in my marriage was not dramatic. It never is with things like this. There's no single moment where the world tilts, and you know with certainty that everything is different now. There's just an ordinary Thursday afternoon in March, a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, and a credit card statement you almost threw away without opening. Almost. Accountants don't miss numbers. That's not a skill, it's a reflex. The same way a musician hears a note slightly off key in a room full of noise, I notice when something doesn't balance. I had spent 6 years auditing budgets worth millions of dollars for companies I'd never heard of, finding the one-line item buried on page 47 that somebody hoped no one would ever reach. I was good at it. I was very good at it. What I had never done in 6 years of marriage and 5 years of that particular skill was turn it on my own life. The statement arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March. It came in a standard white envelope tucked between a water bill and a furniture catalog nobody had asked for. My husband's name was on it, our home address, but the account number was one I had never seen before. I almost set it aside. I almost filed it in the pile of his business mail on the kitchen counter and walked away, almost as doing a lot of work in that sentence. Instead, I opened it. The first charge that stopped me was $2,340 at a jewelry store in South Park Mall. My birthday is in September. Valentine's Day had come and gone 2 months earlier. Our anniversary falls in June. I stood at the kitchen counter and did the mental math the way I always do automatic, without trying, and came up empty. There was no occasion that explained $2,340 at a jewelry store in March. Below that, $670 at the Ballantine Hotel, a 4-star property on the south side of Charlotte, the kind of place that advertises weekend escapes and couples packages on its website. And at the bottom of the page, almost an afterthought, $89 at a florist, dated a Wednesday, a completely ordinary Wednesday in the middle of a completely ordinary week. I set the statement down on the counter and stood very still for a moment. When my husband came home that evening, I asked him about it, calmly, without accusation, just a question the way you ask about anything you don't understand yet. He didn't flinch, didn't pause, didn't look away. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone who has asked a question with an obvious answer, and he explained each charge with the kind of smooth, unhurried confidence that I had always admired in him. The jewelry, he said, was a watch, a thank you gift for a fleet account manager who had referred significant new business to the salon group. The hotel was a 2-day planning retreat with his 2 senior managers, a working weekend to map out the expansion strategy for the 3rd location. And the flowers, those were for the wife of a longtime client who had helped broker a new commercial contract, a gesture of appreciation. Every answer arrived fully formed. No hesitation, no searching for words. Just one reasonable explanation after another delivered with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. The thing about being married to someone who is genuinely charming is that charm has its own gravity. It pulls you toward the explanation you want to believe. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted it badly enough that I almost convinced myself the wanting was the same as knowing. But I didn't throw the statement away. I folded it carefully and slid it into a plain manila folder, the kind I kept in the home office for documents that needed filing. Then I walked to the guest bathroom, opened the cabinet beneath the sink, and placed the folder in the back corner behind a box of spare hand soap. I don't know exactly what I was doing in that moment. I wasn't ready to call it what it was. I just knew I wasn't ready to let it go. The following week, I told Lauren Mercer. Lauren was my closest friend at the logistics firm where I worked, had been really for the better part of 6 years. She was the kind of person who remembered how you took your coffee without being told who noticed when you were quiet in a meeting and checked in afterward. She knew I drank mine black with no sugar, that I took the stairs rather than the elevator because escalators made me uneasy in a way I had never been able to fully articulate, and that I tended to go silent when something was bothering me rather than bringing it up. She was good at reading the silence. We were eating lunch in the break room when I told her quietly with my voice low, the way you talk when you're saying something out loud for the first time, and part of you is still hoping it won't sound as serious as it feels. I showed her the charges on my phone. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand and told me it was probably nothing, that there were explanations, that I should talk to him. I had already talked to him. I told her that too. She squeezed my hand again and said she wouldn't say a word. 48 hours later, my husband came home with a look on his face I hadn't seen before. Not angry exactly, something cooler than anger, more deliberate. He knew. He knew what I had said to Lauren, which specific words I had used, which charges I had mentioned. He repeated details back to me that I had only spoken aloud in that break room with Lauren sitting across from me. I stood in the kitchen and kept my face very still while something rearranged itself permanently inside my chest. I had one friend in this city, one person I had trusted with this, and within 48 hours, she had told him everything, which meant I had no one. My family was far away. The life I had built in Charlotte was built almost entirely around my husband and his world. And now, even the one person I had reached toward had sent my words straight back to him. Lauren had mentioned her boyfriend before in the casual way people mention someone who has become a fixed part of their daily life. She talked about him the way you talk about furniture present. Familiar, unremarkable. She had mentioned once or twice that he had an older brother. I had never asked the brother's name. It had never seemed important. That night, for the first time, I asked, Lauren's boyfriend. I had heard her mention his older brother before, but I had never thought to ask his name. That night, I finally did. His name was Corey, and his last name was the same as my husband's. The Tuesday I flew to Atlanta for a client audit was the Tuesday my husband made his first real move. I didn't know that yet, of course. At 6 a.m, standing at the departures entrance of Charlotte Douglas International Airport with my carry-on and a coffee I hadn't finished. I knew nothing except that I had a 9 o'clock flight and a full day of meetings waiting for me on the other end of it. My husband had insisted on dropping me off. He didn't always do that. Usually I drove myself and left the car in long-term parking. But that morning he'd offered, and it had seemed sweet. He kissed me goodbye at the curb, longer than usual. I remember thinking briefly that it was a nice moment. One of those small, unremarkable gestures that feels like evidence of something good. I picked up my bag and walked through the sliding doors without looking back. The flight was uneventful. Atlanta was overcast and humid in the particular way Atlanta gets in early April, that heavy gray sky that can't quite commit to raining. I took a car from the airport to the Marriott Midtown where the company had booked me for 2 nights. I had a client meeting the following morning at 8, a full day of document review after that, and a return flight on Thursday afternoon. Everything was in order. It stopped being in order at the front desk. I handed over my card, the joint card that my husband and I had held for 4 years, and watched the front desk attendant's expression shift into that carefully neutral look that hospitality, Professionals are trained to wear when something is wrong and they don't want to make a scene. She tried the card twice. Then she looked up and told me very politely that it had been declined. I assumed it was a mistake. I smiled, apologized, and told her I would call the bank. The representative I reached after a brief hold told me that the account associated with the card showed a significant transfer made earlier that morning, $18,500. Moved to a separate business account at 6:14 a.m., approximately 15 minutes after my husband would have returned home from dropping me at the airport. The card had been flagged and suspended as a result of the unusual activity. I asked her to repeat the amount. She did. I thanked her, ended the call, and stood in the lobby of the Marriott Midtown holding my phone with both hands, doing the kind of arithmetic that has nothing to do with spreadsheets. I had $340 in cash in my wallet. My client meeting was at 8 the next morning. My return flight was 48 hours away. And the joint account that was supposed to cover my travel expenses had been emptied by my husband 12 minutes after he watched me walk through an airport entrance. I called him. He didn't answer. I called again and again. I stood near the window in the hotel lobby watching a light rain begin to fall on the street outside, and I called 6 more times over the course of 20 minutes. On the 7th call, he picked up. His voice was unhurried, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from preparation. He told me he had moved some funds around for the business, something about a supplier payment that had come due unexpectedly. He said he'd meant to mention it, that it had slipped his mind with the early morning, and that he'd sort everything out when I got home. He said it the way you'd say you forgot to pick up something at the grocery store. I told him I was standing in a hotel lobby in Atlanta with $340. He said he was sorry about that. He said it very smoothly. I said I had a meeting in the morning. He said he knew, and that I was very capable, and that I'd figure it out. Then he wished me luck and ended the call. I stood there for a long moment after the line went quiet. The lobby was busy around me, people checking in a group of businessmen crossing toward the elevators, a family with too much luggage arguing gently near the entrance. Nobody was paying attention to me. I was just a woman standing by a window in a hotel lobby holding a phone she'd stopped looking at. That was when I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. This was not a mistake. It was not a miscommunication or a forgotten detail or a supplier payment that happened to coincide with my trip out of town. $18,500 moved at 6:14 in the morning, 15 minutes after he dropped me at the airport from an account he knew I depended on to one I had no access to. That is not an accident. That is arithmetic. And I had been doing arithmetic long enough to know the difference. He wanted to see what I would do. Whether I would call him in a panic, beg him to fix it, make myself smaller and more manageable than I had apparently been since finding that statement in March. He wanted to remind me in the clearest possible terms, with a number that was very hard to misread, who controlled the money and therefore who controlled the situation. I walked to the front desk and paid for one night in cash. It took most of what I had. Then I went up to my room, set my alarm for 5:30 in the morning, ordered a $17 sandwich from room service, and wrote it off as a business expense, and spent the next 3 hours reviewing the documents I needed for the following day's meeting. The meeting went well. The client was pleased. I took careful notes and shook hands and smiled and said all the right things. On the inside, I was somewhere else, entirely turning something over. Examining it from every angle the way you examine a problem you've been given without being told what it actually is yet. I flew home on Thursday afternoon. I came back from Atlanta with 2 things: a completed audit report and a decision I couldn't take back. I was done being the woman who almost threw away the credit card statement. I came back from Atlanta with 2 things: a completed audit report and a decision. I audit other people's finances for a living. It was time I audited my own. The first thing I did when I got home was go to my desk and pull out every bank statement, every transaction record, every financial document I could access that was connected to our joint accounts. I printed 2 years' worth of history, 114 pages, and spread them across the dining room table on a Saturday morning while my husband was at the salon. Then I opened my laptop, created a new spreadsheet, and started building what any accountant would recognize immediately: a timeline of anomalies. It took me most of the day. What I found wasn't one smoking gun. It was dozens of small ones. Transfers I hadn't noticed because I hadn't been looking. Charges that made sense in isolation but formed a pattern when you laid them end to end. Recurring payments to accounts I didn't recognize. Gaps in the household deposit schedule that I'd never questioned because I'd never had reason to. 6 years of professional habit had taught me exactly how people hide money when they don't want it found. I had just never expected to need that knowledge at my own dining room table. By the time I heard his car in the driveway, I had closed the laptop, stacked the papers neatly in a new folder, and started making dinner. He came in and kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day was. Fine, I told him. Quiet. He seemed satisfied with that. The following Monday, I did something I had been turning over since the plane ride home from Georgia. I looked up family law attorneys in Charlotte. I wasn't thinking about divorce yet, or I was telling myself I wasn't, but I needed someone who understood financial misconduct in a marriage. Someone who could tell me whether what I was looking at was what I thought it was. I needed a professional opinion that wasn't mine. Diana Reeves came up in several searches. Her office was on East Trade Street on the second floor of a narrow building that sat above a sandwich shop called Giordano's. The stairwell smelled like roasted peppers and fresh bread in a way that should have been comforting. I remember thinking climbing those stairs that it was a strange thing to notice when your life was potentially falling apart. Diana herself was in her early 50s with the kind of steady, unhurried manner that comes from years of sitting across from people in crisis and not being rattled by any of it. She had reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck and a framed print on the wall behind her desk that read simply, "Show me the numbers." I liked her immediately. I sat down, placed my folder on the desk, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she spent several minutes reviewing the documents I had brought, the statements, the spreadsheet, the original credit card statement I had kept in the guest bathroom since March. She didn't rush. She turned pages, made notes on a yellow legal pad, and took her glasses off twice to look at something more closely. Then she looked up and said it plainly the way I would want someone to say it to me. This was not a husband spending household money on a girlfriend. This was systematic financial fraud. The patterns she was seeing, the account structure, the timing of the transfers, the gap between what she suspected the business was earning and what was flowing into our joint accounts pointed to deliberate concealment. She said she wanted to subpoena the financial records from all 3 salon locations. I said yes. She filed the subpoena in the second week of May. 3 days later, my husband came home with flowers. Lily of the Valley, my favorite, a fact that had once seemed romantic and now landed differently. He had also stopped at the market and picked up everything needed for the pasta dish I'd mentioned wanting to try 2 weeks earlier. He cooked it himself, opened a bottle of red wine we'd been keeping for a special occasion, and set the table properly with candles. It was a lovely evening. He was attentive and warm and funny in the way he could be when he wanted something. And I sat across from him and smiled and ate every bite and refilled my glass and said nothing about Diana, Reeves, or the subpoena, or the 114 printed pages currently sitting in a folder in my car. Some performances are harder than others. That one required everything I had. The real discovery came at the end of May on a Tuesday evening when I was working late and decided to go further back through the transaction records Diana had helped me access. There was a pattern I'd noticed, but hadn't fully traced yet, a series of small transfers, regular as a subscription going to the same recipient over a span of months. 14 transactions, 8 months going back to September of the previous year. The total came to $8,400. The notation on each one was vague dinner supplies, miscellaneous, the kind of language that sounds like nothing and means everything. The recipient name attached to the payment app account was V. Monroe. I searched the name. Vanessa Monroe had a public profile on a social media platform, the kind of bright curated presence that stylists often maintain to showcase their work. She was good at her job, from what I could see. The photos were polished and professional. She worked at my husband's uptown location. She was 29 years old or thereabouts, and her profile gave no indication whatsoever that she knew a woman named Brooke Calloway existed. I sat at my desk at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, looking at the screen and tried to inventory what I was feeling. I had expected anger. I had been bracing for it in the abstract. Since March, the hot, obvious kind of rage that arrives when a suspicion becomes a confirmation. What I felt instead was quieter and more complicated than that. Vanessa Monroe thought she was in a relationship with a successful single businessman. She had no idea I was out there. And sitting alone in my office at 9 in the evening, looking at her photos on a screen, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward the woman my husband had been sending money to for 8 months. Not anger, something closer to pity. The payment app transfers were bad enough. What came next was worse. By the time Diana and I had mapped out the full picture in late May, I had stopped thinking of myself as a wife trying to understand her husband. I had started thinking of myself as an auditor assigned to the most important case of my life. And auditors follow the money. The money led to South End. Diana had subpoenaed the bank records tied to our joint account, not just the statements I had printed myself, but the raw transaction data, the kind with routing numbers and memo fields and timestamps that most people never think to look at. It took her paralegal 3 full days to sort through 2 years' worth of entries. When Diana called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon, she had a single printed page waiting on the desk between us. "There's a recurring transfer," she said. $1,800 every month for 14 consecutive months. I already knew how to do the math. $25,200. The apartment was in South End, a neighborhood about 4 miles from our house in Myers Park. New construction, exposed brick in the lobby, a rooftop terrace. The kind of building that shows up in lifestyle magazines spreads about young professionals living their best lives in the city. The lease was in Vanessa Monroe's name. The rent was being pulled directly from our shared account, the same account I deposited my paycheck into every 2 weeks, the same account we used to pay the grocery bill, the water bill, the property taxes on the house we had chosen together. He had been paying for her apartment with our money for over a year. I sat in that chair across from Diana and did not cry. I had run out of that particular reaction somewhere between the jewelry store charge and the hotel bill. What I felt instead was something quieter and colder, the specific kind of clarity that comes when the last piece of a puzzle clicks into place and the picture is even uglier than you had imagined. It was not grief. It was not shock. It was more like watching a final confirmation print itself out in slow, deliberate lines. Diana gave me a moment. She was good at that, knowing when to speak and when to simply let the silence do its work. Then she said, "We'll add this to the dissipation of marital assets claim. 14 months of documented withdrawals, all traceable to a residential lease he never disclosed. That's a significant number, Brooke." I nodded. I picked up my bag. I thanked her. I drove home through the late afternoon traffic on South Boulevard, and when I got there, I walked into the kitchen and made dinner like I had done every evening for 5 years. The suspension came on a Monday morning in early June. I had just set my bag down at my desk, had not even opened my laptop yet when my manager appeared in the doorway of my office. He had a careful, neutral expression on his face, the kind that people practice when they already know something you are about to find out. He asked if I could come down the hall for a few minutes. In the HR conference room, the department director was waiting with a printed form and a very deliberate calm about her. She explained that an anonymous complaint had been submitted to the company's ethics line. The allegation stated that I had accessed and copied sensitive financial data from internal systems for personal use outside the scope of my job responsibilities. They were placing me on a 2-week unpaid suspension while the matter was under review. I signed the acknowledgement form. I shook the director's hand because I did not know what else to do with mine. I packed my laptop into its case, clipped my badge to the side pocket out of habit, and walked to the elevator. I rode it down 6 floors. I crossed the lobby. I pushed through the glass doors into the warm June morning and sat in my car in the parking structure for 11 minutes without moving, without turning the key, without doing anything at all except staring at the concrete wall in front of me and breathing slowly. I knew who had filed that complaint. Not because I had documented proof in that moment, but because I understood by then exactly how this particular mind worked. The April trip had been designed to isolate me financially while I was 2 states away and too far from home to push back in time. This was designed to isolate me professionally to remove my income, to shake my footing while keeping me right here in Charlotte, right here in that house where he could watch me closely and measure how much I had figured out. It was methodical. I could see the structure of it the same way I could see a flawed balance sheet, the entries that didn't belong, the gaps where something had been moved to a place it was never meant to go. The 14 days that followed were the strangest of my life. My husband believed I was home because I had no choice. I thought of it differently. I was home because there was nowhere I needed to be more urgently than exactly where I was close enough to observe, composed enough to stay invisible. Every morning I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a few minutes before he woke up and reminded myself of a single thing. The people who stay quiet are usually the ones who are already ready. I cooked dinner each evening. I asked about the salons, about the staff, about his day. I smiled at the right moments and let silences land naturally. I was a woman leaning on her husband. Because her job was temporarily uncertain, that is what I showed him. That is all I showed him. Around 9 o'clock each night, I told him I needed some fresh air. I drove 2 blocks down, parked beneath a wide oak tree on a quiet residential street, and called Diana from my cell phone with the windows up and the radio off. I kept my voice low, not out of fear, but because speaking quietly helped me stay precise. Diana would walk me through the subpoena progress, the bank record analysis, the pieces she was assembling, one document at a time. "He underestimated you," she said one evening near the end of the second week. "I know," I said. "I've been counting on that." I drove home. I washed my face. I went to sleep. On the last day of my suspension, Diana called at just past 10 in the morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had poured 20 minutes earlier and never touched, watching the way the June light moved slowly across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet. My husband had left for the uptown location 2 hours before. Her voice carried something I had not heard from her before. Not alarm, not excitement. Something more grounded than both the steadiness of a person who has just seen something walk through their door and immediately understood its weight. "Brooke," she said, "someone just walked into my office. You need to come in right now. If you're still here, comment, 'Still watching,' so I know you're with me. And tell me this, if you were in my place. Would you stay quiet and keep gathering proof? Or confront everything right now and risk losing control before the truth is fully exposed?" And just a quick note before we continue, some parts of this story have been adapted with fictional elements for storytelling purposes. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to stop here. I did not change clothes. Diana's call lasted 40 seconds. She said what she needed to say, and I was already moving before she finished the sentence. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, pulled my hair back with an elastic band I found on the windowsill, and walked out the front door in the same jeans and gray t-shirt I had been wearing since breakfast. I did not stop to check the mirror. I did not leave a note. I drove the 11 minutes to East Trade Street the way I drove to work during an emergency. Focused, deliberate, not quite fast enough to attract attention, but close. Diana's office was on the second floor of a narrow brick building, wedged between a print shop and a lunch counter called Giordano's. I had been to this office enough times over the past several weeks that the receptionist recognized me and waved me through without making me wait. Diana was standing in the open doorway of the conference room when I reached the top of the stairs. She stepped aside without a word and let me see for myself. A man was sitting at the far end of the table. He was somewhere in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a collared shirt that had been ironed but was starting to wrinkle at the elbows the way shirts do when someone has been sitting in them tense and still for a long time. In front of him was a canvas bag, the kind people use for groceries, but this one was packed with folders and papers stacked so tightly that the zipper wouldn't fully close. Diana introduced us. His name was Marcus Webb. He had been the general manager of my husband's uptown salon for 4 years, the flagship location, the one my husband talked about most, the one he referenced whenever anyone asked how the business was doing. Marcus had been there since the beginning, hired before the second and third locations ever opened. The previous week, my husband had called Marcus into the back office on a Tuesday afternoon and let him go. No reason given, no written notice, no severance. 4 years of loyalty ended in a conversation that apparently lasted less than 8 minutes. Marcus looked at me steadily when Diana finished the introduction. Then he reached into the canvas bag and began placing folders on the table in a row. I kept personal copies of everything, he said. I had a feeling I was going to need them someday. Diana had told me the numbers would be significant. She had not told me they would be this precise. Marcus had brought the internal QuickBooks files for all 3 salon locations, not the version my husband had submitted to his accountant, but the working files, the ones with every transaction recorded in real time before anything was adjusted or reclassified. He had also brought the actual payroll registers, the monthly revenue summaries, and a folder of vendor contracts that had never been shared with anyone outside the business. The real revenue for all 3 salons combined in the year 2023 was $480,000. The number my husband had declared in his initial divorce filing was $160,000. Diana wrote both figures on a yellow legal pad and pushed it across the table so I could read them side by side. $320,000. That was the gap between what the business actually earned and what he had told the court it earned. I looked at the number for a long time. Then I looked at the payroll register. Vanessa Monroe's name was printed near the bottom of the second page. Her listed title was Senior Brand Consultant. Her monthly salary was $5,200, making her annual compensation $62,400. The payroll records showed she had held this position for 12 consecutive months. Did she work there? I asked. Marcus shook his head once. I ran that location for 4 years. I never saw her perform a single work function. I kept my voice even. This is separate from the payment app transfers I already found. Yes, Diana said. She had anticipated the question. The $8,400 in personal transfers through the payment app covered a different period and were never run through payroll. These are 2 entirely separate channels, combined. The payments to Vanessa Monroe from marital funds exceed $70,000. I wrote that number down in my own handwriting so that my hands would have something to do. Diana opened the next folder. A shell company listed as a marketing and consulting LLC had received $89,000 in payments over the previous 2 years. No registered employees, no documented deliverables, no verifiable clients. The address on file was a mailbox rental center off Independence Boulevard. She laid the 3 figures out in a row on the legal pad. $320,000 in concealed revenue, $62,400 in fraudulent payroll, $89,000 through a company that existed on paper and nowhere else. That's over $470,000 that we can now document and trace, Diana said. The room was very quiet for a moment. Marcus stayed for another 20 minutes answering Diana's questions with the patience of someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation in his head for longer than any of us knew. He described the accounting software, the way entries were categorized, the vendor payments that had been routed through the LLC. He described specific months where the revenue figures had been adjusted, after the fact not corrected adjusted, and the dates those changes were made. Before he stood to leave, he reached into the canvas bag one final time and set a single sheet of paper on the table separately from the rest. It was a wire transfer confirmation. The date on it was from 6 years ago, 2018. The amount was $47,000. The recipient line read Eleanor Calloway. The memo field had been filled in by hand in blue ink loan repaid in full. Marcus looked at both of us. I found that in a physical file folder in the back office. I thought it might matter. He picked up his empty bag and walked out. Diana thanked him at the door. I heard them exchange a few quiet words in the hallway, and then his footsteps moved down the stairs, and the building went still again. I was still looking at the transfer confirmation on the table. Diana came back into the room and sat down. She did not say anything yet. She understood, as she always did, that some information needs a moment before it can be spoken about. $47,000, sent to a woman named Eleanor Calloway, 6 years ago. with a note written in my husband's handwriting claiming the debt had already been settled. I folded the page carefully along its original crease. I smoothed the edge with my thumb. I set it down in front of me and left my hand resting on top of it. Something had just changed. I could not have explained exactly what, not yet, but I felt it the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm moves in. Something in the shape of this entire situation had quietly, irrevocably shifted. And the name on that page was one I had never once heard my husband mention in 5 years of marriage. It was 11 o'clock on a Sunday night when my phone lit up with Lauren Mercer's name. I almost didn't answer. We had not spoken since the afternoon in March when I realized she had carried every word I said straight back to my husband. I had not confronted her about it. I had not sent a message, had not called, had not done anything except quietly remove her from the short list of people I allowed myself to trust. In a season where I was learning to be precise about everything. I had been precise about that too. But it was 11 o'clock on a Sunday and Lauren Mercer did not make late-night phone calls. In the 4 years I had known her, we'd worked at the same logistics firm long enough that she knew my coffee order by heart, and I knew she was terrified of heights she had never once called me after 9. Whatever this was, it was not casual. I picked up. Her voice was quieter than I expected. She asked if we could meet. Not at work, not somewhere familiar. She named a coffee shop on Park Road, a small place near the end of a strip mall, the kind that closes at midnight on weekends and doesn't draw much of a crowd after 10. She said she would explain everything when I got there. I told her I would be there in 20 minutes. The shop was nearly empty when I arrived. A teenager was wiping down the espresso machine behind the counter, and a couple sat near the window on the far side of the room, speaking quietly over their cups. Lauren was already there in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a coffee she had not touched sitting in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept in several days. I sat down across from her and waited. I had learned over the past few months that waiting was often the most productive thing I could do. She started talking before I even got settled. Lauren told me that Corey, my husband's younger brother, whom she had been seeing for the better part of a year, had come to her in January and asked a favor. Nothing dramatic, he had said. Nothing serious. He just wanted her to stay close to Brooke, to listen to let him know if anything seemed off. He had framed it as a family thing. He said my husband and I were going through a rough patch and he was worried, and Lauren was in a position to help without making it into a bigger situation than it needed to be. Lauren said she had agreed because she loved him and because it genuinely did not seem serious at the time. He made it sound like he was trying to protect the marriage, she said. She was looking at the table when she said it. I did not say anything. She had done it for months, listening when I talked, noting what I said, reporting back to Corey in messages she sent from her car or her apartment after we had spent time together. She said she had told herself it was harmless. She said she had stopped asking herself too many questions about it. Then, the week before, she had been at Corey's apartment when his phone rang. She was in the kitchen. He was in the living room. He did not realize she could hear him clearly from where she was standing. He was talking to my husband. He was telling him about Marcus Webb, about the fact that Marcus had been fired, about the fact that Marcus had apparently reached out to someone, about the sequence of events that week that Corey had somehow pieced together. When Corey finished giving his update, there was a pause, and then Lauren heard my husband's voice come through the phone speaker. He laughed first, then he said clearly and without any particular concern, "Good. One less problem. Women like Brooke always give up eventually." Lauren said the kitchen went very still around her. She said she stood there holding a glass of water for a long time without moving. "I kept thinking about the word eventually," she told me. Like it wasn't even a question, like he had already decided how this ended. She reached into her bag and placed a phone on the table between us, screen up. She had screenshot 6 months of messages between her and Corey organized by date starting in January. I did not read all of them there in the booth. I read enough. The messages were not vague. Corey had been precise. He told Lauren which topics to bring up, which questions to ask, how to guide a conversation, so that I would say more than I intended to. He described specific things to watch for whether I seemed worried about money, whether I had mentioned a lawyer, Whether I seemed like I was getting ideas, as he put it, there were messages confirming that information Lauren had passed along had been received and acted on. The first message in the chain was dated the 8th of January, 2024, 6 months before I found the credit card statement on that Thursday afternoon in March, 6 months before I thought any of this had started. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. He had been planning this since January, for the entire stretch of time when I believed I was uncovering something, piecing it together on my own terms. Staying one step ahead, he had already mapped the territory. He had placed people around me before I knew there was anything to look for. He had assumed I would find something eventually, and he had prepared for it. He thought he was 10 steps ahead. He had not counted on Lauren hearing that phone call. We stayed in the booth for another half hour. Lauren transferred the screenshots to me directly. She also gave me printed copies she had made at a FedEx the day before she had thought of that herself, without anyone asking her to. I told Diana about all of it in a brief message from the parking lot before I drove away. Lauren walked me to my car. She stopped at the driver's side door and stood there for a moment with her arms crossed over her chest, the way people do when they are trying to hold themselves together. "I'm sorry, Brooke," she said. I didn't know what kind of person he actually was. I genuinely didn't know. I looked at her for a moment. Then I nodded. I believed her not because I had stopped being careful, but because I knew the difference by then, between a person who had chosen cruelty and a person who had allowed themselves not to ask enough questions. Lauren was the second kind. That did not make what she had done disappear. It just meant it belonged in a different folder. Trust once it fractures along a specific line does not mend back to its original shape. It can hold weight again, but you always know where the break was. I got in the car and drove home. Lauren's printed pages sat on the passenger seat beside me the whole way back. I did not turn the radio on. The streets were quiet in that particular way that Sunday nights in Charlotte get after 11 long stretches of green traffic lights, parking lots that have mostly cleared out. The city settling into something slower and more honest than it shows during the day. I thought about planning, about the specific kind of patience it takes to begin dismantling something 6 months before the other person has any reason to be on guard, about how long my husband must have been watching me, measuring me, deciding exactly what I was and wasn't capable of, and then building his plan around the version of me he believed existed. He had been wrong about that version. That night, I drove home with Lauren's evidence on the seat beside me, thinking about how long a person can spend planning the end of something while you are still busy believing in it. I noticed the gray sedan on 3 consecutive days. It was parked in different spots each time, once along the curb outside the office building where I had been working before the suspension, once in the lot of the pharmacy across the street, and once 2 blocks down in a metered space facing the intersection. Different positions. Same vehicle, same dark-tinted windows, same license plate ending in 74K. I was not working during those weeks. The suspension meant I had no reason to be in that part of Uptown on a regular schedule. But I had been driving by the building out of habit, the way you still reach for a light switch in a room you haven't used. In weeks and on the 3rd morning, I pulled into a parking structure across the street and sat there for 40 minutes watching. The sedan did not move. Nobody got out. I took a photograph of the plate on my phone and called Diana. Diana did not treat it as paranoia. She had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a client who was unraveling and a client who was paying attention. She made 2 phone calls that afternoon and had a name by the following morning. The sedan had been rented under a private investigator's license registered to a man named Ray Kowalski. He had spent 22 years on the Charlotte police force, hired in 1991. Retired in 2013 working out of the South Division before moving to the Financial Crimes Unit in his final years on the job. After retirement, he had opened a small private investigations firm out of an office in Dilworth. According to Diana's contact, he had a solid reputation. Careful, methodical. The kind of investigator who documented everything and rarely made mistakes. Diana told me she would handle it directly. What she did not tell me until 2 days later was that she had not needed to go looking for Ray Kowalski at all. He had already come to her. Diana called me into her office on a Wednesday morning and asked me to sit down before she started talking. That was unusual. Diana typically delivered information the way she did everything else efficiently, while still standing, already moving to the next point. When she asked me to sit, I sat, and I kept my hands still in my lap and listened. Ray Kowalski had walked into her office the previous afternoon with a digital recorder and a written summary of a meeting he had attended 10 days earlier. My husband had contacted him through a referral someone Ray had done routine work for several years back. They had met at a restaurant in South End. My husband had explained the situation. He was involved in a divorce proceeding. His wife had been behaving suspiciously, and he needed documentation. What he had actually asked for was something different. He wanted Ray to photograph me in the company of another man, any man, Diana said, using the exact word my husband had apparently used, and to present those photographs in a way that would constitute evidence of infidelity. Staged if necessary, arranged if needed. He had been specific about the level of quality required. He said he wanted something a judge would believe. Ray had let him finish talking. Then Ray had told him no. Not because of the legal exposure, though, that was considerable. Not because the request itself was unusual in the private investigations world, though it was more explicit than most. Ray had told Diana that he had spent 22 years in this city watching people in the worst moments of their lives, and in all that time he had developed a fairly reliable sense of who was in front of him. He said that when my husband made the request, he had been smiling, not nervously, not apologetically, smiling the way a person smiles when they are describing something they are genuinely looking forward to. Ray said he had looked at my husband across that restaurant table and understood with complete clarity that this was not a man in the middle of a painful divorce trying to protect himself. This was a man who was enjoying the process. Ray had excused himself, gone to his car, and driven directly to his office, where he had written up a full summary of the meeting from memory, while it was still fresh. He had also reviewed the recording he had made. He recorded all client consultations as a standard practice, with a notice printed on his intake form, and confirmed that the request had been captured clearly. He had brought all of it to Diana. He told me he's worked in this city for 22 years, Diana said, looking at me steadily across her desk. And he said he had never once been asked to deliberately destroy an innocent person with that much visible satisfaction. Those were his words. Visible satisfaction. I looked at the window behind her for a moment. I thought about the kiss at Charlotte Douglas Airport in April, the one that lasted a half-second longer than usual. I thought about the dinners he had cooked during my suspension, the way he had refilled my water glass, the way he had asked about my day. I thought about the smile Diana had just described. He had not been managing the situation. He had been savoring it. Diana let that settle. Then she pulled out the legal pad she used for running tallies and walked me through what we now had. April, the funds transfer while I was in Atlanta. He had tried to cut off my financial footing while I was 2 states away and couldn't push back in time. That was the first strike. June, the complaint filed with my company's ethics line. He had tried to cut off my professional footing to isolate me from my income and my credibility at work. That was the second. August, the private investigator, the staged photographs that never happened, the attempt to manufacture a version of me that would be easier to dismiss in court. That was the third. 3 separate attacks, 3 different categories: financial, professional, reputational, each one designed to leave a different kind of damage. Each one arriving at a point when the previous one had already been absorbed. He planned these in sequence, Diana said. That matters in court. This isn't a pattern of poor judgment. This is a documented campaign. She set down her pen and looked at me directly. He just handed us everything we need. I nodded slowly. I understood what she meant. The recording, the written summary, Ray's willingness to testify, it was not just evidence of what my husband had tried to do. It was evidence of how he thought, of the specific, methodical pleasure he took in the process of trying to take someone apart. 3 strikes. He had come for my money, my job, and my reputation. But he had not stopped there. I already knew that. Diana's phone had rung while I was still sitting in that chair, and the look on her face when she glanced at the screen told me that the next part of the story was already in motion. The interview at Meridian Financial went perfectly. I wore the navy blazer I kept for moments that required precision, the one I had bought the year I was promoted to senior accountant and had not worn since. I answered every question cleanly, without hesitation, without filler. The hiring manager walked me out herself and shook my hand twice at the elevator. I drove back to Charlotte with every window down and the radio on, and for the first time in months I felt something that resembled normal. Not happy exactly, but functional, purposeful. Like a person who still had a future she was building toward. That feeling lasted exactly 72 hours. Meridian called on a Thursday afternoon. The woman on the phone was polite and unhurried. She thanked me for my time and said they had decided to move in a different direction. No elaboration, no explanation. A careful practiced neutrality that told me nothing and everything at the same time. I sat in my car in the parking structure near our house and stared at the phone in my hand for a long moment. Then I called Diana. It took her less than 48 hours to find out what had happened. Meridian had received a letter anonymous no return address 2 days after my interview. The letter alleged that I had misappropriated funds at my previous employer, that I had used my position as a senior accountant to redirect company money for personal benefit, and that the matter had been handled quietly to avoid public exposure. The letter had included what appeared to be supporting documentation, formatted carefully, printed on what looked like official stationery. Diana told me the documents were fabricated. She could see it in the structure of them, inconsistencies in the formatting dates that didn't align with actual company records, terminology that was slightly wrong in ways that someone outside the industry might not notice, but that any experienced accountant would catch immediately. I had been in that parking structure when she told me all of this. I sat there for a while after we hung up, not moving, not reaching for the radio. Then I cried. Not from grief, not from the hollow, disoriented sadness that had followed the early discoveries, the credit card charges, the Atlanta, mourning the HR conference room. This was different. This was cold and clear and absolutely certain of itself. This was the specific anger of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has just been pushed past the boundary of patience into something harder and more permanent. I let it happen. I sat in the parking structure and let it move through me completely, and then I wiped my face with the back of my hand and called Diana again. "That's 4, I said when she picked up. "I want to finish this." She said, "I know, we're close." The second week of September, Diana called on a Tuesday morning. Her voice had the careful, measured qualities she used when she was about to say something that required my full attention. She told me that someone had contacted her office that morning not by email, not through the firm's intake form, but by calling the main line and asking specifically to speak with the attorney representing Brooke Calloway. The caller had given her name. It was Eleanor Calloway. I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store when Diana said it. I did not respond immediately. I held the phone against my ear and sat very still for 3 minutes. I know it was 3 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard move from 9:47 to 9:50. Eleanor Calloway, the name I had seen on that wire transfer document in Diana's conference room. $47,000 6 years ago, sent by my husband to a woman who shared his last name. A woman I had called my mother-in-law for 5 years without ever once feeling like she saw me as anything more than a peripheral figure in her son's life. Diana asked if I wanted her to set up the meeting. I said yes before I had finished thinking about it. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in Dilworth, a neighborhood of wide sidewalks and old oak trees and houses that had been converted into smaller units over the decades. The kind of place that holds its history quietly without making a show of it. I found parking on the street and sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. I thought about the 5 years I had spent in the same orbit as this woman. Holiday dinners where she sat at the end of the table and responded to questions with the minimum number of words required. Birthday calls that lasted 4 minutes. A single hug at our wedding that felt like something she had decided in advance to get through efficiently. I had interpreted her distance as the particular reserve of a certain kind of older woman, self-contained, private, uninterested in performances of warmth. I had never asked myself what might be underneath it. The building's interior stairwell smelled like cedar and old carpet. I climbed to the 3rd floor and found the unit at the end of the hall. I raised my hand to knock. The door opened before my knuckles made contact. Eleanor Calloway was shorter than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply never stood this close to her without a table or a room full of other people between us. She was in her early 60s, with gray hair cut close to her face and the kind of posture that comes not from ease, but from decades of deciding not to let things show. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression gave away nothing. Then she stepped to one side. "Come in," she said. "We need to talk." I crossed the threshold and heard the door close behind me. The apartment was small and very clean, with afternoon light coming through a single window that faced the street. There was a kettle on the stove that had recently been used, 2 cups on the counter already set out. She had been expecting me to say yes. Something shifted in me as I registered that detail. She had put out 2 cups, which meant she had already decided this meeting would happen before Diana had even called to confirm it. She had not been waiting to see what I would do. She had been waiting for the right moment to act on something she had already made up her mind about. I thought about Diana's witness list, which now included Eleanor Calloway's name. I knew because Diana had told me, and because it made a certain cold kind of logical sense that my husband's attorney had seen that name on the filing and assumed she was appearing for the defense. The surname was the same. The assumption was automatic. No one on his legal team had made a phone call to verify. Diana had described it as a gift. I had agreed with her. I stood in Eleanor's small, clean apartment and understood that I was about to find out whether this woman was a lifeline or something else entirely. I had called her my mother for 5 years. She'd never once used that word for me. I stepped further into the room and sat down in the chair she gestured toward, and I waited. Eleanor made tea without asking if I wanted any. She set the cup in front of me, sat down on the opposite side of the small kitchen table, and crossed her arms. Not defensively, more the way a person holds themselves when they have something difficult to say and have decided to say it without softening it first. There was no small talk, no preliminary politeness. She looked at me once directly, and then she began. "I need to tell you something." Her voice was flat, and even the voice of a person who had rehearsed this in her own head many times and had decided that the rehearsed version was the only one she trusted herself to deliver. I wrapped both hands around the teacup and listened. 6 years ago, in the spring of 2018, her son had come to her with a plan. He wanted to open a salon in uptown Charlotte, the flagship location, the one that would anchor everything that came after. He had the space, he had the concept, he had the contacts. What he did not have was the capital to sign the lease and cover the first 6 months of operating costs. He needed $47,000. Eleanor had spent 30 years building that amount, not quickly, not through inheritance or circumstance, but through the specific, patient accumulation of a woman who had worked a front desk job at a medical practice for decades and treated every paycheck as something to be managed carefully rather than spent freely. It was her retirement buffer, her emergency margin. The number she had arrived at after years of quiet discipline. She gave it to him. He wrote a promissory note by hand, his own idea, she said, which she had taken at the time as a sign of seriousness. The note stated the amount, the expected repayment timeline of 2 years, and included his signature in the lower right corner. Eleanor had folded it and placed it in a Ziploc bag in her kitchen drawer where it stayed. 2 years passed, then a third. He had opened the second salon by then, and the third. Eleanor had not pressed him early. She understood that businesses take time, that cash flow is unpredictable in the first years, that patience was part of the arrangement. When she finally raised the subject directly, his response was not a plan or a timeline. It was a letter from an attorney. The letter stated that the promissory note she held was not legally enforceable under North Carolina law as written. The language was formal and final, the kind designed to signal that the conversation was over before it had begun. Eleanor told me she had read that letter 3 times at her kitchen table. Then she had folded it, placed it next to the promissory note in the Ziploc bag, and slid the drawer closed. She had not thrown either document away. "I knew I would need them eventually," she said. "I didn't know for what." She paused then. looked at the table for a moment rather than at me. When she looked up again, something had shifted slightly in her expression, not softer exactly, but more deliberate, like she was about to say something she had also rehearsed but was less certain about delivering. "I never liked you, Brooke." She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it land more cleanly than it would have otherwise. "I thought you were too quiet, too careful. I thought you were hiding something, that the way you measured your words meant you were calculating something rather than simply being private." She paused. "I was looking at you the way I had learned to look at people from living with someone who actually was hiding things. I put that lens on you and I kept it there. That was wrong." "I was wrong about you." I did not respond immediately. There was something almost relieving about hearing it said, plainly not apologized for, excessively not buried in explanation, just acknowledged and set down. I nodded once. She nodded back. We moved on. 3 months before she had contacted Diana's office, her son had called her late on a weeknight. He had been out to dinner with Corey, his younger brother, the one who had always served as his closest ally in the family, and he had called her from the car on his way home, his voice loose and a little too comfortable in the way voices get after a few drinks more than intended. He wanted to talk about the divorce. Specifically, he wanted to talk about Brooke. He told his mother that Brooke would not find anything significant. He said she was good with spreadsheets. He used the word dismissively, the way you describe a skill that is useful but limited, but that she didn't understand how money actually moved at his level. He said she would accept whatever settlement figure he offered because she would have no real alternative. He said it with the easy confidence of someone describing an outcome they considered already decided. Then he laughed. Eleanor said the laugh was what stayed with her, not the words she had heard versions of those words before in a different voice, from a different man. In the same kitchen where she was standing when she took that call. 30 years earlier, her husband had spoken about her the same way, with that same light, dismissive certainty, as though the people around him were variables he had already solved for rather than people with their own capacity to act. She had been silent then. She had accepted what was offered because she had believed at the time that silence was the only reasonable option available to a woman in her position. She had spent years afterward understanding exactly what that silence had cost her. She had stood in her kitchen after the call ended in the dark for a long time. Then she had opened the drawer and taken out the Ziploc bag. "He used the same voice his father used with me 30 years ago," she said. I stayed quiet then. I lost everything. I will not let that happen again. She reached across the table and opened the drawer set into the side of the kitchen island. The Ziploc bag was still there, exactly as she had described it, slightly worn at the seal, transparent enough that you could see the folded documents inside without opening it. She took out the promissory note and set it on the table between us. Then she slid it toward me. It was a single sheet of standard white paper, handwritten in blue ink. The penmanship was careful, the writing of someone who had wanted the document to appear serious. The amount was written out in both numerals and words. The repayment terms were clearly stated, and in the lower right corners, slightly pressured into the paper as if he had been bearing down harder than necessary, was his signature. The date at the top was March 14th, 2018. I picked it up with both hands. I thought about what it takes for a mother to reach this point, to sit across from her daughter-in-law in a small apartment and place evidence of her own son's dishonesty on the table between them. To have watched someone she raised become the kind of person she recognized from her own past, and to have decided finally that recognition was not the same as tolerance. What Eleanor did that afternoon was not a small thing. It was not a gesture made lightly or arrived at quickly. It was the end of a long, private reckoning, and she had made it in the same quiet, deliberate way she did everything else. I held the note carefully and did not say anything for a moment. There was nothing that needed to be said. Some things are simply true, and they do not require a response. They only require a witness. Diana added Eleanor to the official witness list on October 2nd. The trial date was set for November 14th, 6 weeks. I used every one of them. Diana and I met 3 times in October, once to go through the financial documents in sequence, once to review the testimony structure, and once to walk through every possible counter-argument his attorney might raise and decide in advance how we would respond to each one. Diana was the kind of lawyer who did not like surprises. Neither was I. We were well matched in that respect. I had also gone back to work by then. The suspension had ended, and the internal investigation had concluded without finding any basis for the original complaint which Diana had expected, because the complaint had never been designed to hold up under scrutiny. It had been designed to disrupt, and it had served that purpose, and now it was over. I returned to my desk on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, said good morning to my colleagues, and opened my laptop as if nothing had happened. Some of them knew something had been going on. None of them asked. That suited me fine. By Diana's advice, I was still living in the Myers Park house through the trial date. It was a legal strategy, not a personal choice. Voluntarily vacating a shared residence before the court proceedings concluded could complicate the asset claims she was building. So we stayed, my husband and I, in the house we had chosen together, moving through it like two strangers assigned to the same waiting room who had silently agreed not to acknowledge each other directly. He left his coffee mug in the sink in the mornings. I washed it without comment. He came home late most nights and went directly upstairs. I slept on the couch in the living room, which I had started doing in September without either of us remarking on it. The house was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. It was the quiet of two people who had run out of anything worth performing for each other. I thought sometimes about the version of this house that had existed 5 years ago, the Sunday mornings, the particular angle of the kitchen light in winter, the way the neighborhood sounded on a holiday evening. It did not make me sad exactly. It made me precise. It reminded me of exactly what I was sitting across a courtroom table to reclaim. The night of November 13th, I sat down at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock with a cup of coffee and 47 pages of documents. I arranged them in chronological order the way I would have organized any complex audit file. The March credit card statement went first 3 charges: a jewelry store, a hotel, a florist. The original anomaly that had started all of it. Behind it went the Atlanta transaction record, the wire transfer timestamp. The $340 in cash I had documented with a photograph on my phone the morning I had sat in that Marriott room and decided not to come home early. Then came Marcus Webb's files, the QuickBooks, exports, the payroll registers, the LLC transfer records. The internal revenue summaries that showed $480,000 where $160,000 had been reported. Behind those, the Venmo transaction log that Diana's paralegal had formatted into a clean exhibit cross-referenced with dates and amounts. After that, the screenshots Lauren had transferred to me in the Park Road parking lot, printed in sequence and organized by date. Corey's instructions, the timeline that stretched back to January, the proof that this had been a plan before it had been a problem. Then Ray Kowalski's written summary and the audio file notation. Diana had it transcribed and formatted as a formal exhibit. The anonymous letter sent to Meridian Financials, attached to the forensic analysis showing the inconsistencies in the fabricated documents. And finally, in its Ziploc bag, the promissory note in blue ink on white paper, $47,000 signed and dated in March of 2018. I looked at the full spread of it across the kitchen table and thought about a moment from the 3rd year of our marriage. We had been standing in this same kitchen. I had been making dinner, something with pasta, I think something ordinary, and I had asked about the business accounts. A specific question about a specific line item I had noticed while doing our household taxes. He'd been leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and he had looked at me with an expression I had learned by then to recognize as patience being performed rather than felt. "You're good with numbers, Brooke," he had said. "But you don't really understand how money works at this level." I had been holding a wooden spoon. I had not responded. I had turned back to the stove and kept cooking. And I had filed the comment away in the same internal drawer where I kept things I did not yet know what to do with. I looked at the 47 pages on the kitchen table in front of me. For the first time in 8 months, maybe longer, I smiled. Not a polite smile, not a managed one. A real one, small and certain. the kind that doesn't need anyone else in the room to mean something. My phone buzzed against the table at 10:23. It was a text message from Eleanor. It said, "I'll be there tomorrow. Don't stop now." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. I set the phone face up on the table next to the Ziploc bag and sat with it for a few minutes. Eleanor was not a person who communicated in reassurances. She was not warm in the conventional sense, and she made no effort to perform warmth she did not feel, which meant the 4 words "don't stop" now were not a pleasantry. They were a statement of position from a woman who had spent 30 years not saying what she meant and had apparently decided somewhere in a small Dilworth apartment that she was done with that particular habit. I stacked the 47 pages, carefully aligned the edges, and placed them in the expandable folder Diana had given me for exactly this purpose. I clipped the Ziploc bag to the inside front cover where it would be the first thing visible when the folder was opened. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked to the living room, lay down on the couch with the blanket I had been keeping there since September, and closed my eyes. The house was quiet around me. Upstairs somewhere, my husband was in the bedroom we had shared for 5 years, presumably asleep or pretending to be. Outside, the Myers Park neighborhood was doing what it always did at midnight, settling into itself, the occasional car, passing someone's porch light on down the street. I thought about what he had said in this kitchen 3 years ago, about numbers and levels, and the confident assumption that there were things beyond my comprehension. I thought about the 47 pages in the folder on the kitchen table assembled from 8 months of following exactly the things he had been certain I wouldn't understand. In a few hours, I would find out whether 8 months was enough. I turned off the lamp on the end table. For the first time in longer than I could easily remember, sleep came immediately without the usual waiting. I woke at 5:45 without an alarm. By 7:15, I was dressed. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway bathroom and put in my earrings and looked at myself for a moment. I was wearing the gray blazer the one he had commented on years ago, saying it made me look too serious. Like that had been a criticism. Like serious was something a person needed to apologize for. I picked up the expandable folder from the kitchen table. I walked to the front door. I did not look back at the house as I went. In a few hours, I would find out if 8 months was enough. I turned off the last light, and for the first time in a very long time, I had actually slept. Courtroom 4 smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. The fluorescent lights ran the length of the ceiling in long, parallel strips, and one of them buzzed with a faint, irregular flicker that made everything feel slightly unreal. The kind of lighting that exists in places where consequential things happen, but nobody thinks to make comfortable. I noticed it when I walked in, and then I stopped noticing it. I felt completely calm. I had not expected that. 8 months of research preparation, sleepless nights, and the particular weight of knowing what I knew. And yet when I sat down at the plaintiff's table next to Diana on the morning of November 14th, my hands were steady. My breathing was even. I had spent so long preparing for this room that walking into it felt less like an arrival and more like a completion. Diana set her folders on the table in a precise row. She had done this before many times, and it showed not in any performance of confidence, but in the complete absence of unnecessary movement. Every document was where it needed to be. Every exhibit had a number. She had told me once that a courtroom was just a room where organized information was presented to a decision maker, and that the side with better organization almost always won. I had understood her then. Sitting beside her now, I understood her differently. Judge Patricia Wynne entered at 9 o'clock exactly. She was 57 with silver hair pinned back in a way that suggested function over preference, and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck that she had not yet put on. She moved to the bench with the particular efficiency of someone who had been running proceedings for long enough that the choreography of it was entirely automatic. She reviewed the docket in front of her for approximately 45 seconds, set it down, and looked at both tables. I had done my research on Judge Wynne during the weeks of preparation. She had been on the family court bench for 14 years. Colleagues described her as thorough direct, and notably impatient with filings that didn't support the numbers they cited. One attorney who had appeared before her multiple times had told Diana, apparently, that Judge Wynn had a particular response to financial misrepresentation, not anger, but a kind of surgical attention that made it very difficult for inaccurate figures to survive her questions. She asked for documentation on things other judges accepted at face value. I had spent 8 months generating documentation. I felt for the first time since March like I was in exactly the right room. My husband was seated 12 feet away at the defense table. He was wearing a navy suit. I recognized it immediately. He'd worn it in a photograph I had found on a social media account several months earlier, a group picture taken at an outdoor event sometime in the spring. Vanessa Monroe had been in that photograph standing close to him, both of them smiling at whoever was holding the camera. He had not known I had seen it. He did not know I was thinking about it now. He looked composed. That was consistent with everything I knew about him. He had always been good at composure. It was one of the first things I had found attractive about him years ago, and one of the things I had spent the last 8 months learning to read correctly. His composure was not the same as calm. It was the practiced surface of someone who had learned early that looking untroubled was its own kind of leverage. Vanessa was seated in the gallery directly behind him. She had her legs crossed and her chin slightly raised, and she was wearing something that would have been more appropriate for a dinner reservation than a courtroom. She did not look at me. I did not need her to. His attorney opened with the confident brevity of someone who believed the morning would go smoothly. Your Honor, my client's wife contributed minimally to the marital estate. The business valuation of $160,000 is accurate, supported by filed tax returns, and any suggestion to the contrary is without merit. He sat down. He looked satisfied. Diana stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not move quickly. She approached the matter the way she approached everything, methodically, without performance, letting the information do the work that theatrics would only undermine. Your Honor, she said, we'll be presenting documentation today that speaks directly to that valuation. I'd like to begin with the internal financial records from all 3 salon locations. What followed was the most organized 40 minutes I had ever witnessed in a professional setting, and I had spent 15 years in accounting. Diana presented the QuickBooks files that Marcus Webb had brought to her office in June, not the version filed with the business's accountant, but the working files, the ones that recorded every transaction as it occurred. The real combined revenue for the 3 salons in 2023 was $480,000. The number submitted in the divorce filing was $160,000. Diana displayed both figures simultaneously on the courtroom screen and let them sit there together for a moment before she said anything else. Then she moved to the payroll records. Vanessa Monroe appeared as a listed employee, senior brand consultant, $5,200 per month, 12 consecutive months. Total compensation, $62,400. Diana presented a signed statement from Marcus Webb confirming that Vanessa Monroe had not performed any documented work function at any of the 3 salon locations during that period. His attorney objected. Judge Wynn overruled without looking up from the exhibit. The shell company came next. An LLC registered to a mailbox address off Independence Boulevard had received $89,000 in transfers over the previous 2 years. No payroll records. No client contracts, no deliverables of any kind. His attorney objected again. Judge Wynn overruled again, and this time she made a note on the pad in front of her. Diana then presented the 4 systematic actions taken against me during the course of the proceedings, the April funds transfer, while I was out of state, the anonymous workplace complaint, the private investigator engagement and the recorded conversation in which fabricated evidence had been requested, and the fraudulent letter sent to a prospective employer. Each item had its own exhibit number. Each was supported by documentation. His attorney objected 3 more times. Judge Wynn overruled each one with the same measured quiet. And after the 3rd, she set down her pen and looked at his attorney for a moment in a way that appeared to discourage further interruption. I watched my husband's face through all of it. The composure held mostly, but there were small things, the way his jaw tightened when the revenue figures went up on the screen. The way his left hand moved to the edge of the table and then back again when Diana presented Ray Kowalski's written summary and mentioned the recording. His attorney leaned toward him once and said something brief in a low voice. My husband nodded. His expression did not change. 2 weeks before the trial date, Diana had filed the official witness list with the court. Eleanor Calloway's name had been on it. His attorney had seen it and had not made a single inquiry, no phone call, no letter, no request for a deposition. The name was Calloway. The assumption apparently had been automatic. That assumption was about to become the most consequential mistake of his carefully constructed case. Diana straightened the stack of documents on the table in front of her. She turned toward Judge Wynn with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has saved the most important thing for last. Not because of drama, but because that is simply where it belonged in the sequence. Your Honor, she said, we'd like to call one final witness, Eleanor Calloway. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the movies. Not staged quiet. The real kind, the kind that falls when everyone in a room stops moving at the same moment without coordinating it. The air conditioning clicked and hummed above the jury box. A seat creaked in the gallery. Everything else held still. The side door opened. Eleanor Calloway walked in, wearing a navy wool coat. She had not removed her handbag held in both hands. She moved straight down the aisle without acknowledging the gallery or the defense table. She did not look at her son. She placed her hand on the Bible, stated her name clearly for the record, and sat down in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Diana. I was watching my husband from 12 feet away. His composure had held through 4 hours of exhibits, the revenue figures, the payroll records, the recording from Ray Kowalski's meeting. Through all of it, he had maintained the practiced steadiness of a man who had prepared himself for a difficult morning and was managing it precisely. It did not hold now. His right hand moved to the edge of the table and gripped it. The knuckles went white. His attorney, who had been making notes on a legal pad all morning, set his pen down and did not pick it up again. In the gallery behind them, Vanessa uncrossed her legs. The angle of her chin dropped. She was looking at the back of my husband's head. He did not turn around. Diana began without preamble. Mrs. Calloway, can you tell the court about a phone call you received approximately 3 months ago? My son called me on a weeknight. It was late. He had been out to dinner and he had been drinking. He called from his car on the way home. What did he say? He told me about his plans for the divorce. Eleanor's voice stayed at the same register throughout, controlled the way things are controlled when a person has decided on the version they are delivering and will not be moved from it. He told me the business was doing well, better than $480,000 a year across all 3 locations. Diana let that number settle. Did he say anything about how the finances had been reported in the divorce filing? He said the number in the filing was not the real number. He said he had moved money through a company he set up so it would be harder to find. He said the LLC was how he kept things clean. That was his word, clean. Did he mention anyone else? He mentioned Vanessa Monroe. He said she was on the payroll because it was the neatest way to move money out of the business without it looking like what it was. Did he say anything about his wife specifically? A pause, not from emotion, from precision. He said she was good at spreadsheets but didn't understand how money actually worked. He said she would take whatever he offered because she wouldn't have any other option. Eleanor looked at her hands briefly. He said it the way you say something you've already decided is true. Diana moved to the evidence table and lifted a clear plastic sleeve. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Plaintiff's Exhibit 22, a handwritten promissory note dated March 14, 2018. His attorney stood. Objection. Relevance. The note documents $47,000 transferred from Eleanor Calloway to the defendant in 2018, Diana said. Funds used to establish the first salon location, the primary asset under dispute. It speaks directly to the financial origins of that asset. Judge Wynn looked at the sleeve. Overruled, admitted. The note entered the record. Diana did not elaborate on what it had cost Eleanor to keep it or the years it had spent in a Ziploc bag in a kitchen drawer in Dilworth. The document said what it needed to say. Diana set down her notes. Mrs. Calloway, why are you here today? The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. "Because his father did the same thing to me 30 years ago," Eleanor said. I was quiet then. I accepted what I was given and told myself it was the reasonable thing to do. I lost everything I had worked for. She paused. "I raised my son to be better than that. He chose not to be. So I chose to be here." The room absorbed that. Nobody moved. I looked at Vanessa across the courtroom. She was still watching the back of my husband's head. He had not turned around once since Eleanor entered, not when she was sworn in, not during her testimony, not when the note was admitted. Vanessa's expression had changed from what it had been at the start of the morning. Something was moving across her face that I recognized, not guilt exactly, but the specific look of someone beginning to understand that the story they were given was not the whole story. I had worn that expression once. I knew what it meant. "No further questions, Your Honor." Diana sat down beside me without looking at me. Her pen rested on the notepad in front of her, untouched. His attorney straightened his jacket and looked at Eleanor for a moment. "No questions, Your Honor." He sat down. There was nothing to ask. Eleanor had stated facts without editorializing, without performing emotion, without asking for sympathy. She had walked in, placed her hand on the Bible, and told the truth in a steady voice, and there was no angle from which that could be made to look like anything else. Judge Wynn reached up and removed her reading glasses. She set them on the bench in front of her and looked at the room. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Patricia Wynn did not need to raise her voice. She picked up the reading glasses she had set on the bench, put them on, and looked at the pages in front of her. Then she began to read, and the room stayed exactly as quiet as it had been. There was no signal, no gavel, no request for attention. The attention was already there. It had been there since Eleanor Calloway had walked out through the side door 3 minutes ago, and nobody in the room had moved enough to break it. I had my hands flat on the table in front of me. Diana was beside me, pen down still. I looked at the judge and I listened. The first item was the asset division. 72% of the total marital estate was awarded to the plaintiff. Judge Wynn read the figure without inflection, the way you read a number that has been arrived at through a documented process and requires no additional emphasis to make its point. The remaining 28% went to the defendant. His attorney wrote something on his legal pad. My husband did not move. The Myers Park house was addressed separately. Due to documented fraudulent conduct during the course of the proceedings, the defendant's equitable claim to the marital residence had been substantially forfeited. The property was awarded in full to the plaintiff, 100%. I had lived in that house for 5 years. I had chosen the paint color in the hallway and the light fixture above the kitchen table. I had mowed the back lawn in the summers because I found it meditative, and I had learned the sound the third porch step made in cold weather. I had thought, at various points in the last 8 months, that I might lose it, that it might be one more thing he managed to take. I sat at that table and heard it awarded back to me, and I felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled in a very long time. The business valuation came next. The court rejected the figure of $160,000 submitted in the defendant's original filing. An independent valuation would be conducted based on the actual documented revenue, $480,000 annually as established by the internal financial records entered into evidence. The 3 salon locations would be assessed accordingly, and the plaintiff's share of the marital estate would reflect that corrected figure. The LLC accounts were frozen effective immediately. All assets held within those entities were folded into the marital estate for purposes of division. Judge Wynn read that item the way she had read all the others steadily, without pause, the voice of someone working through a list, because the list was accurate and needed to be read. I heard his attorney exhale beside my husband, a slow, controlled breath, the kind that means a person is managing something. Then Judge Wynn's voice dropped by a half register, not loud, the opposite of loud. But something in the room shifted when it happened. The particular quality of silence changed, became more concentrated. The way silence does when everyone in a room understands simultaneously that what is coming next is different in kind from what came before. The financial disclosures submitted under oath were being referred to the North Carolina Attorney General's office for review of potential perjury. The payroll records in the LLC transfer history were being referred to the IRS for examination of potential tax fraud. The matter of the private investigator, the documented request to fabricate evidence of infidelity, supported by a recorded conversation, was being referred to the district attorney's office for consideration of obstruction of justice charges. She read each referral the same way she had read the asset division, matter-of-factly, as if they were simply the next items on the list, which they were. Then she set the pages down. She reached to the side of the bench and picked up a single printed sheet separate from the main documents placed slightly apart. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up, over the top of her reading glasses, directly at my husband. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I have in front of me a written communication in which you stated that your wife, and I'm quoting directly, was good with numbers but didn't understand how money actually worked." The room was a held breath. "I think the record established today speaks to that point fairly definitively." She set the page down. My husband started to rise from his chair. It was not a deliberate movement. It was the involuntary response of a person whose body has decided to do something before their mind has fully authorized it. His attorney's hand came down on his forearm immediately firmly, and he was pulled back into his seat. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked for the first time since I had known him, like a man who had run out of the next prepared thing to say. I watched him from 12 feet away. I had thought at various points over the past 8 months about what I would feel in this moment. I had expected anger or relief, or the particular vindication of a person who has been underestimated, proving the point in the most complete way possible. What I felt instead was simpler and quieter than any of those things. I felt clear, like a window that had been filmed over for years had finally been cleaned from both sides, and the light coming through it was just light, not complicated, not charged, just accurate. I looked at him, and I saw him. Not the version I had believed in, not the version I had been afraid of for the last 8 months. Just the actual person, finally visible, without the story around him. That was enough. That was in fact everything. Diana gathered her documents. I turned to look at the gallery. The chair directly behind my husband, the one Vanessa Monroe had occupied since 9 o'clock that morning, legs crossed, chin raised. The posture of a person who had arrived confident in the outcome was empty. No coat left behind, no bag on the seat, no indication of when she had gone or which moment had been the one that finally moved her. She had simply stopped being there. I looked at the empty chair for a moment. Then I picked up my folder, pushed my chair back from the table, and stood. The hallway outside Courtroom 4 smelled like floor wax and old coffee. I stood there with my folder pressed against my chest and just breathed. The specific way you breathe when something heavy has finally been set down, not the breath of relief exactly, but the breath of a body remembering what it feels like to carry its own weight and nothing more. The corridor was wide and fluorescent lit, with a row of wooden benches along one wall that nobody was sitting on. A bailiff walked past without looking at me. Someone at the far end was speaking quietly into a phone. I had been inside that building for 6 hours. It felt like a much longer unit of time than that. Diana came out behind me and put a hand briefly on my shoulder. She did not say anything immediately, which was consistent with everything I knew about her. She was not a person who filled important silences with words that weren't necessary. After a moment, she said she would call me tomorrow to go over the next steps. There were financial transfers to arrange documents to file a timeline for the house. I told her I understood. She squeezed my shoulder, once picked up her briefcase, and walked toward the elevator with the unhurried purpose of someone already thinking about what came next. I stayed where I was for a moment longer. Lauren was standing at the far end of the hallway near the water fountain close to the wall. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and her eyes were red in the way eyes get when someone has been crying quietly and trying not to show it. She was not moving toward me. She was simply standing there, making herself available and leaving the decision entirely to me. I looked at her across the length of the corridor. There was a version of this moment where I kept walking. There was a version where I said something measured and final that closed the door cleanly. I had thought about both of those versions during the 6 weeks of preparation, turning them over in my mind the way you turn over a problem you haven't fully solved yet. What I did instead was look at her and nod once. Small, direct. It was not forgiveness, not entirely. It was something more specific than that, an acknowledgement. You came back when it mattered. You stood in a parking lot on a Sunday night and handed me 6 months of evidence and said, "I'm sorry." And that was not a small thing, even if the thing that made it necessary was also not a small thing. Both of those facts could exist at the same time. I had learned over the past 8 months that most true things required holding more than one fact at once. Lauren pressed her lips together and nodded back. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She did not try to close the distance between us, and I did not invite her to. That was where we were. And it was honest, and honest was enough for now. Eleanor was at the other end of the hallway. She was standing alone near the exit stairwell, her handbag still held in both hands in front of her, the way she had been holding it when she walked into the courtroom that morning. She had not stopped to speak with anyone. She was simply waiting, or perhaps not waiting for anything specific. Just existing in the space after something difficult in the way that people who have done hard things sometimes need to stand still for a moment before they can move again. I walked toward her. I did not prepare what I would say. By the time I reached her, I had not thought of anything that felt adequate, and I decided that adequate was not the right standard for this moment anyway. I stopped beside her and placed my hand over hers where she was gripping the bag. She did not move at first. She looked straight ahead at the exit door the way she had looked straight ahead at everything in that courtroom, without flinching, without softening, without asking anyone to read anything into her expression that she had not chosen to put there. Then her hand opened. Her fingers loosened their grip on the bag and turned, and for 1 second she held my hand with both of hers before releasing it and straightening her coat. She did not say anything, neither did I. I had called this woman my mother for 5 years, and she had never once used that word for me. And in that hallway, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the distant sound of the building going about its ordinary afternoon, none of that seemed like the most important thing anymore. What seemed important was that she had walked into that courtroom, placed her hand on the Bible, and told the truth in a steady voice, because she had decided that silence was no longer something she could afford. That was not a small thing. It would not be a small thing no matter what came after. I took the stairs down and crossed the lobby and walked out into the November afternoon. Charlotte in the middle of November has a particular quality of light, pale and flat, the kind that makes everything look a little more honest than it does in other seasons. The trees along the street had mostly lost their leaves, but a few were still holding on yellow-brown against the gray sky. I stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse for a moment and let the cold air come in. Then I walked to the parking structure and found the Nissan Rogue on the second level where I had left it at 7:45 that morning. I put the folder on the passenger seat, got in, and sat there without starting the engine. My phone buzzed. An unknown number, not a contact, not anyone in my recent history. I opened the message. "I didn't know anything about you. I'm sorry." I looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the screen dimmed and I had to touch it to read the words again. I thought about what it had cost her to send that and what it might mean, or not mean, for the life she was now going to have to build from a story she had only just understood was not the one she had been living. She had not designed what he built. She had simply lived inside it, believing the version of the walls she had been shown. I understood that. I did not know what she would do with what she now knew. That was hers to figure out, not mine. I did not reply. I did not delete the message either. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat next to the folder. I started the car. I pulled out of the parking structure and turned onto the street and drove without a specific destination in mind for the first time in 8 months. Every day since March, I had known exactly where I was going. Diana's office, the courthouse, the grocery store, the stretch of road 2 blocks from the house where I parked under an oak tree and called my lawyer in the dark. Every day had been a movement towards something fixed and necessary. Today there was no fixed point. The case was over. The house was mine. The folder on the seat beside me contained the last version of a document I had spent 8 months building, and it was finished. And I was driving through Charlotte on a November afternoon with nowhere I needed to be by any particular time. The feeling was not what I had expected. It did not feel like winning. It did not feel like the specific satisfaction of a long effort reaching its conclusion. It felt quieter and more physical than that, like a tightness I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing it was there had finally released, and my body was remembering what it felt like to breathe without working for it, like being handed back something that had always belonged to you. I drove. The city moved past the windows. Somewhere ahead, the road opened up, and I had not decided yet which way I was going to turn, and for the first time in a very long time. That did not frighten me at all. 6 months later, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Noda with 2 plants I actually remembered to water and a coffee maker that belonged entirely to me. Noda is Charlotte's arts district, a neighborhood of converted warehouses and narrow streets where someone is always hanging something on a wall or playing something through an open window. On weekend evenings, the live music from the bar 2 blocks over drifted up to my floor, and I had learned to keep the window cracked so I could hear it while I made dinner. It was not the Myers Park House. It was smaller, louder, less polished, and entirely mine in a way that the other place I now understood had never fully been. I had started the new job in January, a small independent audit firm on the east side of the city. The work was straightforward. The hours were flexible, and nobody there knew my name from anything except my resume. That last part mattered more than I had expected. There is something clarifying about being known only for what you can actually do, rather than for the story that has been attached to you. On Saturday mornings, I made coffee and sat at the table by the window before opening my laptop. The table was small, just large enough for a cup and a notebook, and whatever I happened to be reading, and it faced the street so I could watch the neighborhood come awake at its own pace. The coffee shop across the road opened at 7. The couple on the second floor of the building opposite always walked their dog at 7:30, the same route every week, the dog pulling left at the corner and the man letting it. A woman who lived on my floor practiced guitar on her balcony on Saturday mornings, the same 3 songs in the same order, and I had come to find the repetition genuinely comforting in a way I would not have predicted. I had spent a long time not being able to sit still in a quiet room without my mind moving immediately to the next problem that needed solving. That had been necessary for a while. It had kept me functional through months when functioning required active effort. But somewhere between November and May, it had loosened. And I had relearned the difference between being alone and being lonely. They had felt like the same thing for a period. They were not, in fact, the same thing at all. That distinction had taken me longer to recover than I expected, and I was glad now to have it back. I had stopped following the legal proceedings closely, but I knew the broad shape of things. The North Carolina Attorney General's office had confirmed the perjury referral was under active review. The IRS audit of the salon businesses was ongoing. Marcus had told me that in February, when he called to say he had found a new position managing a salon group in Raleigh. The district attorney's office had not yet announced a decision on the obstruction matter, but Diana had told me in March that my role in that process was finished. I had done what I needed to do. What happened next belonged to other people in other rooms, and I had made my peace with releasing it. Corey had lost his position at the insurance firm in December. The text message records had become part of the public court file, and his employer had reached their own conclusions. I had not sought that outcome. It had simply followed from the facts being complete. Vanessa had closed her social media accounts in December and left Charlotte by February. Marcus had mentioned it briefly. He had heard from someone still at the Uptown location. I had not asked for details. I still had the unread message on my phone from the day of the verdict. I didn't know anything about you. I'm sorry. I had not replied, and I had not deleted it. I was not certain what I intended to do with it eventually. She had not designed what he built. She had lived inside it for nearly 2 years without understanding the materials it was made from, and that was its own kind of damage to carry forward. I did not envy her the work of figuring out what came next. But that work was hers, not mine, and I had learned by then to be precise about which things belonged to me and which did not. Lauren and I had coffee about once a month since January. Not the way we used to, not the easy, unguarded closeness of two people who had never had a reason to be careful. Something more deliberate. We were rebuilding from the point after the break, rather than pretending the break had not happened, and there was a version of that which could hold weight again. Even if it would never look exactly alike before. That was probably the honest version of most repaired things. The Christmas card from Eleanor arrived in the second week of December. A plain white envelope, my name in her handwriting on the front, the same careful, slightly pressured script I had seen on the promissory note in the courtroom. Inside was a simple card with no printed message, just a blank space for whatever the sender chose to write. She had written 3 words centered on the card in blue ink. You were right. No signature, no elaboration, no context for what the acknowledgement had cost her to write and seal and send. Just those 3 words. I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet. It was still there in May. I had thought during the harder months that reaching the end would feel a particular way, that there would be a recognizable moment of arrival, a shift I could point to. What I had not anticipated was how ordinary it would feel, not disappointing, just quieter than expected. Like a sound that had been present so long that its absence took time to register as silence, rather than as something missing. I was not the same person who had found that credit card statement on a Thursday afternoon in March. I did not think I was supposed to be. 8 months of paying close attention to the difference between what is true and what is being performed that changes the way you see. Not worse, just more accurately. I had gotten good at accurate. I intended to stay that way. That Saturday morning, I finished my coffee, set the cup on the counter, and opened my laptop. A new audit file was waiting a small logistics company. Clean accounts, nothing unusual in the preliminary review. Straightforward numbers, clear columns. Nothing personal in any of it, which was exactly what I needed it to be. I positioned my hands over the keyboard. Outside, the flower cart man was arranging his buckets on the corner. The dog from across the street was pulling its owner toward the coffee shop. The guitarist on my floor had started her first song. The city was doing what it did on Saturday mornings, unhurried, ordinary, entirely indifferent to everything that had led me to this particular table, at this particular window. I sat there for a moment before I typed anything. Just sat and looked at the street and breathed. The cursor blinked in the empty audit file. I had been sitting at this table for 10 minutes without typing a single character, which was unusual for me. I am not by nature a person who stares at blank pages. I am a person who opens a file and begins methodically from the first line, working forward. That is how I have always approached the work, and it has served me well. But that Saturday morning, I sat with my hands in my lap and looked at the empty columns and found myself thinking not about the logistics company whose accounts were waiting, but about the 14 months that had led me to this particular chair at this particular window. 14 months. I turned the number over the way I would turn over any figure that needed to be understood in context. There are things another person can take from you. Money, yes. I had watched that happen in real time, transfer by transfer. The marital account drained toward purposes that had nothing to do with the marriage. A job, yes. The anonymous letter to Meridian had cost me an opportunity I had earned, and the ethics complaint before it had cost me 2 weeks of income and a month of professional credibility. Security, yes. The particular feeling of safety that comes from believing you understand the structure of your own life. That had been taken so gradually I had not noticed it going until it was already gone. These are real losses. I do not minimize them. They cost time and money and the specific energy that only difficult things require. But they were recoverable. Every one of them. There's only one thing that cannot be taken unless you hand it over yourself. That is the knowledge of what you know. The recognition, quiet, persistent. Impossible to entirely silence that something does not add up, that the explanation is too smooth, that the numbers, when you look at them directly, do not say what you are being told they say. I am an accountant, I have spent 15 years reading numbers for other people, finding the places where the columns tell a different story than the summary, where the rounding is a little too convenient, where a figure has been moved from one category to another in a way that is technically defensible, but practically misleading. I am good at this. It is not a complicated skill, but it requires a specific willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what you expect or hope to find. I had not applied that willingness to my own life, not because I lacked the ability, because I had made a choice not once dramatically, but in small increments over 5 years to accept the explanations I was given rather than follow the thread of what I actually observed. That is a particular kind of blindness. Not the blindness of ignorance, but the chosen kind. The kind where some part of you already knows and another part of you decides that knowing is too expensive right now, and you file it away and go back to making dinner. I had done that. I own that fully. What I learned not from the lawyers, not from the courtroom, but from the 8 months of sitting in parking lots at night and following the evidence wherever it went, was not that people cannot be trusted. That would be the wrong lesson. An easy lesson and a costly one, because it closes more doors than it protects. What I learned was this: trust yourself first. Trust the feeling in your chest when the story you are being told does not match the story the evidence tells. Trust the moment when a kiss lasts half a second longer than it should, and something in you registers it before your mind has finished explaining it away. Trust the instinct that says look more carefully before you accept the version of things that has been prepared for you. You do not need to be loud to be dangerous to someone counting on your silence. You only need to be paying attention. You need to be willing to follow a number to where it actually leads, even when the destination is somewhere you would have preferred not to go. That willingness to look and to keep looking is the one thing that cannot be taken from you unless you choose to put it down. Saturday mornings in Noda have a particular rhythm now that I have grown attached to. The guitarist on my floor plays at 8. The flower cart is set up by 8:15. The light that comes through my window between 8 and 9 has a specific quality, low and pale. The kind that makes the street below look like it is still deciding what kind of day it wants to be. I make 1 cup of coffee. I sit at this table. I do not think about courtrooms or hidden accounts or the architecture of a lie that was being built while I was busy believing in something else. I just sit. I drink the coffee while it is still warm. I watch Charlotte wake up. That is what I fought for. Not the house, not the settlement, not the outcome of referrals to offices whose processes will unfold without me. Those mattered, and they were right, and I do not regret pursuing any of them. But underneath all of it, what I actually needed to reclaim was this: the right to sit in a quiet room on a Saturday morning and be present in it without bracing for the next thing. I looked at the cursor blinking in the empty file. A logistics company, clean accounts, straightforward entries waiting to be examined by someone willing to look at them honestly. Outside, the morning light had shifted warmer now, coming through the window at the angle it reaches in May, when Charlotte finally stops hedging and commits to the season. The guitarist downstairs finished her 2nd song and started her 3rd. I placed my hands on the keyboard. These were someone else's numbers, not a map to anything hidden, not evidence of anything, just the ordinary record of a business moving through its days. Clean figures, honest columns, a story told in the language I knew best, belonging entirely to someone I had never met, asking nothing of me except attention and precision. I began to type. Just the numbers. Clean numbers, honest ones, part of someone else's story entirely. And mine, for the first time, was finished. If you've made it this far, you already know this wasn't just a story about divorce. It was a story about family betrayal, the kind that doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the person sleeping next to you, from the brother-in-law sending instructions on how to use your best friend against you, from a system of quiet erosion that begins long before you notice anything is wrong. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives in small adjustments. A kiss that lasts half a second too long, a number that doesn't quite add up, an explanation that is just a little too smooth. I was a woman who read financial statements for a living and still missed the ones being written about her own life. That is not a confession I make lightly, but I make it honestly, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve a version of me that pretends she always knew. Here is what I want you to take from this "don't do what I did." Don't file away the thing your gut is telling you because the truth feels too expensive to look at directly. The cost of looking is always lower than the cost of not looking. Family betrayal leaves marks that take years to understand. Don't wait until the damage is complete before you decide to pay attention. The lesson isn't trust no one. The lesson is trust yourself first. Before the explanation, before the reassurance, before the version of events that has been prepared for you. I also believe, and I say this as someone who sat in a parking lot at midnight, wondering how everything had gone so wrong, that God doesn't always move loudly. I prayed for clarity more than outcomes. Clarity eventually was exactly what I received. Family revenge is not what I sought. What I sought was truth documented and placed in front of people whose job was to act on it. What followed was not mine to design. Family revenge sounds powerful, but what actually restored me was simpler. It was the moment I stopped being afraid of what I might find and started following the numbers wherever they led. That willingness is the one thing no one can take from you. Family revenge makes for a dramatic word. What makes for a life worth living is the quiet Saturday morning on the other side of all of it, when the only thing open on your laptop is work that has nothing to do with any of this. Thank you for walking this road with me all the way to the end. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Brooke's position? At what point would you have made a different choice? I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Quick note, while this story draws on real emotional truths and recognizable social dynamics, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style of content isn't your preference, no hard feelings. There's plenty out there for every kind of viewer.
Thanks for your time today. I'll see you again in the next story.